Oh my God, it's only Tuesday. Hi, I'm Nick. This is 10 Minutes with Nick. And interestingly enough, on this fine, bright, sunny Tuesday, if you happen to be in Los Angeles, because if you're in Buffalo, they are getting snow right now, which is never quite as fun in March. It's fun in like November, December, January, February, but March, it gets a little old. But it's neither here nor there, because today we're going to talk about war. We're not going to talk about my dating life. We're not going to talk about anything silly. We're going to talk about war and what it's good for. The answer is not much. There's a saying, and I don't know who the saying is attributed to. I'm so sorry. I'm just like I'm slamming my S's into the microphone. I am so sorry. But there's a saying, and I don't know who it's attributed to, but that it might actually be from Lord of the Rings, which would be appropriate for me. Only the dead have seen the end of war. What does that mean? It means that the world has never been without war. Only the dead have seen the end of it. Meaning they're the only ones who have passed beyond war and have actually gotten to peace. Let's think about the history of the world for a second. Journey with me, if you will, into the far past of the world. Let's not even go too crazy into the past. Like, we could go back to caveman days and we could technically probably classify that as war, even though we weren't technically defining war at the time. Let's just go to the first book of the Bible, Genesis. What's a pretty frequent occurrence in Genesis? War, battles, fights between different groups of people. Even in the Bible, the book that preaches peace, war features heavily. In fact, the coming of the kingdom is seen as a war between the forces of good and evil in some cases. Obviously, in the Bible, the forces of good win out because God is all powerful. If you go to other mythological backgrounds, we're dealing with it in the secular. If you go to other mythological backgrounds, you see that there's a little bit more of a struggle between good and evil. But basically, life is sort of constantly war. Now, why is this coming up now in particular? Because in a similar way to the war on terror, the war in Israel and Gaza is drawing a lot of attention, and it's drawing a lot of attention from young people, and young people have more free time on their hands to sit around and think about these things, and in the case of today's generations, get existentially terrified by it. A couple things we need to get out of the way quickly, just as we discuss war. First and foremost, war is never not awful. It is always awful. Anybody who says, oh, but what about the justified wars of like the 40s and the 30s? Just because war is justified does not mean it is nice, does not mean it is pretty. You know who dies mostly in war? Civilians. And it's usually the civilians of the losing side that die in pretty frequent doses. Let's take World War II, because it's an easy one for us all to say the Germans in that case, the Nazi army, those were the bad guys. Like, they were, even before the world knew about what they were doing with the Holocaust, the Nazis were pretty much trampling over the rights of people just as they went. The Soviet Union were not good guys, but they were fighting with the good guys. We'll deal with them in a minute. When the Allies eventually started to turn the tide of that war and push into Germany, first of all, Britain had been bombed to hell. I don't know if you know about bombs. They explode. And there's no such thing as a smart bomb. All a smart bomb means is that a bomb is guided by a computer to a target. And then it explodes. That explosion comes with a lot of metal, a lot of explosive material, and a lot of force. Quite honestly, if you're in a certain range from the bomb, the pieces of the bomb isn't even what gets you. It's the concussive force of the bomb striking the ground or striking the target. So the Blitz of London brought on a lot of civilian casualties for the Allies. Now, there weren't any civilian casualties in the United States, which is why the United States tends to remember World War I and World War II in more glowingly patriotic terms. But when the tide turned and the Allies started to push back against Germany in Europe, they began what became a firebombing campaign. Famously, Kurt Vonnegut wrote about the city of Dresden and the aftermath of the firebombing in Dresden. Horrific is the only way to describe what Kurt Vonnegut describes in Germany. I'm not going to try and paint a picture of it. Go read any of Kurt Vonnegut's books. Slaughterhouse-Five is a good one. But it's not pretty. It wasn't pretty then. So I would say to any youngsters who are looking at the current war and saying, my God, how can we tolerate civilian casualties? There's no such thing as a war with no civilian casualties. Now, granted, in this particular instance, we may say, well, look at the unjustness of wreaking civilian casualties on a population where you are allegedly already wreaking civilian casualties based on an occupation. And whether or not the Gaza Strip meets the definition of occupied is a matter for legal debate, not a matter for Twitter debate. So I'm sorry to say, you're not going to solve that on social media. If you want to try and solve that, go sit in the halls of power in the United Nations, go sit in the halls of power in the United States, and try to have a voice there where you may actually get the issue resolved. But on Twitter, you're not going to resolve it. We have more access to horrific images now. But I'll leave you with this. At the end of World War II, the United States pressed forward in the Pacific Campaign. At that point, the Japanese had essentially sent signals that there would be no surrender. They would not surrender. Didn't matter what was happening in Europe. They would fight to the bitter end. And the United States was left with a couple of choices. Number one, they could do what they had been doing in the Pacific, which is island hopping and sending in the Marines and losing scores of Marines and essentially having to kill every Japanese soldier on every single island unless they could somehow get them to lay down their weapons, or bombing the crap out of the Japanese homeland. And bomb the crap out of the Japanese homeland is the way they took. And in Japan, the prevalent form of construction at the time was essentially paper. It was more, obviously, it was more structurally sturdy than that, but the effect of it was to create a structure that essentially was, wrapped in a highly flammable material. And as horrific as the firebombing of Dresden was, the firebombing of Japan was just as, if not more, horrific. And the firebombing wasn't enough. The firebombing wiped out cities. Laid waste to cities, burnt them to the ground. And the people inside the city as well. And when the firebombing didn't work, it was Harry Truman who said they were going to drop the atomic bomb, famously now made famous in Oppenheimer, somewhat rosy-colored glasses, slightly truthful glasses, slightly rosy-colored glasses, And the dropping of the atomic bomb didn't wipe out cities; it wiped out generations. War is not pretty. Even if we consider a war justifiable, it is not pretty. And that's because the main casualty of war and the main way to stop an army is to break the country from which the army comes. This is sort of a somber 10 minutes today, but it was on my mind. I figured I would say it into the internet, see if anybody identified with it. Remember that. So when you think about war, your first thought should always be, number one, remember to weigh the cost of the civilian casualties that are going to happen. And number two, remember that only the dead have seen the end of war, and we live in a world that has never been free of war. And we can perhaps realize the need for prayer to bring an end to that stage in human existence. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. Either way, I'm Nick. This is 10 Minutes with Nick. Have a great day.